Okay, chapter 10, Republican Ascendancy. Now, it opens up the opening vignette with Tecumseh. Tecumseh was an Indian chieftain who had a brother who is called the Prophet. He got the name the Prophet, folk, because he predicted an eclipse, which actually happened. Now, any of you who know anything about astronomy know that the eclipses are predictable. I'm not going to say they're easy, but they can be predicted. A person who knows enough mathematics. Anyway, his brother predicted an eclipse that actually happened, and the Indians held him in awe and looked on him as being a prophet. So between Tecumseh and the Prophet, they went around trying to round up all the Indians to fight one last fight to stop the white man. Again, the fighting was suicide. It was too late. Too late, even too little. They met William Henry Harrison, who later became President of the United States. William Henry Harrison defeated Tecumseh. Tecumseh kept fighting until he was finally killed. Tecumseh, during the War of 1812, allied himself with the British, but it was a bad alliance because the British did not win the War of 1812. Nobody won it. Tecumseh wound up relying heavily on the British and losing. Now, the Revolution of 1800, it's called. 1800 was the first time in American history where a president from one party peacefully transferred the office to a president of the other party. John Adams was a Federalist, and because the Constitution said so, John Adams peacefully gave up the office to Thomas Jefferson of the other party. Now, there was a certain thing though about this election. Let's pretend this is a ballot in those days. In those days, the electors voted for the president and vice president on the same ballot. Well, in 1800, a bunch of electors put down Thomas Jefferson's name first, and underneath it they wrote Aaron Burr. And when the votes were counted, Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr were tied. Now, every elector who voted this way meant for Aaron Burr to be vice president and Thomas Jefferson to be president. Now, today this can't happen because when the electors meet, they vote for president and vice president on a separate ballot. The president is voted for in one ballot, the vice president on another. But in those days, they voted for the same ballot. That meant that Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr were tied. Burr, knowing that the electors wanted him to be vice president, said, "No, I'm tied. The election must go to the House of Representatives." When the House of Representatives, no man could get a majority of the votes. Again, Aaron Burr, folk, even your book calls him a scoundrel. And there are several times where this showed up. Aaron Burr was a scoundrel. Anyway, Alexander Hamilton stepped in. Alexander Hamilton disliked Thomas Jefferson, but he said to the electors, to the House members, "Listen, I do not want Aaron Burr to be president. Thomas Jefferson is bad enough, but Aaron Burr is worse." So he persuaded some of his Federalist electors to not vote at all. And ironically, when it was all the smoke had cleared, Thomas Jefferson owed his election to Hamilton, who had been his political enemy, but Hamilton said no to Burr. Well, shortly after that, Aaron Burr ran for governor of New York, and Alexander Hamilton, who was from New York himself, said, "I don't think Aaron Burr would make a good governor of New York." And they started hurling all kinds of accusations at each other, including sexual irregularities and stuff I don't want to get into. But the two men hated each other. Now, does anybody know what the outcome of this was?
A duel.
A duel. Finally, Aaron Burr challenged Alexander Hamilton to a duel in what has become the most famous duel in history. And by the way, this duel eventually led to the outlawing of duels. We do not know for sure. I've read several accounts of this. Alexander Hamilton, if he'd have fired straight into the air, Aaron Burr was obligated to fire straight in the air, and the two men were supposed to shake hands and make up. Instead, Hamilton's bullet went over Aaron Burr's head at an angle. And it was like a 45-degree. No, was it, did he intend to shoot straight up or straight at him? We don't know. Anyway, Hamilton got the first shot. It was the rules of the game. Hamilton's shot missed. Aaron Burr shot for Hamilton to kill him. Aaron Burr's shot hit Hamilton's abdomen. The duel was over after that. Just 2 shots fired. One by... Each man had 2 pistols, by the way. They had 2 shots off before loading. Again, though, Burr thought that with my enemy dead, I can go on to become president. Wrong. Burr was dead politically. Burr, neither the Federalists or Republicans have anything to do with him. Burr went on to try to form his own kingdom somewhere down around what is today Mississippi and Louisiana. We don't know what he was trying to do, but he wound up completely out of politics and hated by everybody. Burr lost, and eventually it became foolish to issue a challenge. Now, I want to say this about the subject of dueling, and this is on the test I'm making up. In the South, they were slow at fighting duels. And one of my wife's uncles, great uncles, in 1830, was killed in a duel. James Wilds by name. So this went on, and your book mentions that the Southern people still fought duels because they felt like it was the honorable way to settle a difference. But Andrew Jackson challenged Henry Clay to a duel one time, and Henry Clay said, I don't believe in that, and I won't join. And because Henry Clay, see, it was considered dishonorable to refuse a challenge. But Henry Clay said, dishonorable, I'm not going to fight you. And it became eventually illegal and foolish to issue a challenge. And a lot of it had to do with the most famous duel in all history, Aaron Burr, Alexander Hamilton. You might say, figuratively speaking, Burr lost. Not that Hamilton won, but Burr lost. Now, about this time in Virginia, there occurred a slave uprising called Gabriel's Rebellion. Gabriel's Rebellion never came off. Now, Gabriel might have been influenced by Haiti, where there was a successful slave uprising in Haiti. But anyway, a thunderstorm came up, and a lot of slaves who were trying to follow Gabriel became alarmed. They started to report to their masters what Gabriel was doing, Gabriel Prosser. Gabriel Prosser's plot was uncovered. Gabriel Prosser was hanged, but nevertheless, it struck fear in the hearts of Virginia slave owners, and a lot of Virginians started selling their slaves south. In fact, the people living west of the Appalachians in Virginia almost completely gave up on slavery, where that land was not good for slaveholding anyway. It was not a cotton land. And eventually, the state of Virginia was split in 2. And if you look on a map, you see 2 Virginias, Virginia and West Virginia. West Virginia eventually broke away from Virginia and formed its own state. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. But Virginia was not as much of a slave state as some of the others, because the Virginia people tended to sell their slaves farther south. But Virginia remained strongly pro-slavery, though, in spite. Several members of the rebellion were hanged. Vice President Jefferson wrote a letter to James Monroe, who also became president, said, and instead of killing these slaves that rebelled, deport them back to Africa, deport them to the West Indies, but don't kill them. That's just going to make them stirred up and make them more angry. So to Jefferson's credit, he advocated deportation instead of hanging. All right. Thomas Jefferson, when he became president, dressed in work clothes, saying, I'm for the farmer, I'm for the common man. Thomas Jefferson had been a widower for a long time. He'd been married for several years, and when his wife died, we now know he had a liaison with Sally Heming, and that's why he never married. Sally Heming was part white. Now, someone this morning took offense at what I'm saying, but what I'm saying is the truth. If you don't like it, take it up with everybody. In those days, and largely today, if one of your parents was black, you're looked on as being black. Barack Obama had a white mother, but he was called a black man. I mean, again, this is this is the way it is. No, I did not make the rules. Now, I had a person who said at this point, I'm of mixed race and I want to be what I want to be. I said, you be what you want to be, but let me remind you, it's the way that, it's the rules of the game. I mean, whether you like it or not, it's the way it is. I mean, again, don't blame me for saying it. I'm just telling you the way it is. But anyway, Sally Hemings' father was white. Sally Hemings was of mixed race, and a lot of persons at the time said she looked very white. And Jefferson had his liaison with her and bore 6 children by her. Again, folk, this is part of your history that we forgot about for 150 years, but it's been recently uncovered. Thomas Jefferson then, because he didn't have a wife, during his term there was no high society in Washington. Now, let me explain. George Washington had a wife, and during the time that he was president, she would entertain the people in her home. She'd throw parties, and of course, they did not live in Washington, D.C. They lived first in Philadelphia, then in New York, but she'd throw parties, and she was looked on as being the leader among the women in the government. And this has been true ever since. The First Lady is like head of the high society Washington folk. John Adams had a wife, and she was also the leader of the high society. They moved to Washington, and Mrs. Adams would do her laundry, didn't have surgery, and she would hang her laundry in what has today become a very important room in the White House. But in, I believe, the East Room, where Mrs. Adams used to hang her laundry. But anyway, she was high up in society, top of society in Washington life. Thomas Jefferson, no wife that was alive. During his day, there was no high society in Washington. He would greet people at the door, even drop-ins who arrived unannounced. He would sit down with his nightgown and slippers on and discuss affairs with some very high up people. Don't you know that President of the United States, you're supposed to dress up? No, I don't know that. I'll dress the way I want to. Very plain, very common. Didn't try to make a show of himself. Jefferson wanted a nation of farmers. He said a family farmer is where a man can work and slowly gain wealth. Don't count on it, folk. Farmers is one of the most risky business you can do. You're solely, totally dependent on the weather, which you can't control. A tornado can wipe you out, or a drought can wipe you out. But Jefferson believed that the rains would usually come. They usually do. But during my lifetime, Ohio has experienced a drought. Georgia has experienced a drought, and right now the state of California that had been having a drought, all of a sudden they're having flooding, both of which are bad. Some of you might be aware of this. I mean, anyway. Jefferson tried to save money to the point where he even paid his secretary out of his own pockets rather than pay his secretary out of government money, even though by any right, I mean, anyone can tell you the president has a right to have a secretary. In fact, the president needs a secretary, and he should pay the secretary out of government money. Jefferson wouldn't even do that. Now, in those days, all secretaries were men. The idea of a female secretary came about later. Now, John Adams, in order to try to keep a hold of the patronage, had decided that I know what I'll do. I've been elected out, my party's been elected out of Congress, and I've been elected out of the presidency, so I'm going to appoint judges. So he appointed a bunch of judges, and he was still signing the paperwork using candlelight or oil lamp at midnight, signing for judgeships. And when he assigned a judge, he put the judgeship in an envelope and put the envelope in the mailroom of the White House. Fine and dandy. Basically, all these judges he appointed were Federalists. Well, didn't work. Because when Jefferson took office, he saw this mailroom and he had the Secretary of State say, what should I do about these appointments? The Secretary of State said, don't send them. All right, this led to one of the more famous cases in history. You might notice I wrote it in cursive. Again, that's where you write Supreme Court cases. Marbury versus Madison. Now, Marbury was one of the judges whom John Adams had appointed to be a federal judge. James Madison the Secretary of State said, I'm not going to deliver your judgeship. Marbury took the case to court saying, John Adams appointed me, I should be judge. Madison said, I'm not going to deliver. Well, to make a long story short, I mean, I don't know all the details. I've read about it, but I mean, I don't understand all the legal tangling. What happened was the Supreme Court struck down as unconstitutional a law that had been passed by Congress. Folks, they usurped that right. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review. They usurped it. They were wise enough never to use it again until 1857, when they misused it. But at one time, when I was in college, they said only some 80 federal laws have been declared unconstitutional. Today, every law that's passed by the federal government has to undergo judicial review. You know, a law about to be passed by the House, passed by the Senate, and sent to the President for signature, and then it's like somebody's going to take that law to the courts, and the courts have to determine whether it's constitutional or not. This gives the courts more power than any branch of government. Now, folk, what I'm saying is the absolute truth. The Supreme Court can make a decision 5-4, and that decision is the law of the land. It takes 2/3 of both houses and 3/4 of the states to overturn it. When did this last happen? It last happened in 1912. 105 years ago with the income tax law. Well, no, 107 years ago. 170 years. Nobody today can remember it. Congress passed an income tax law in around 1912. The Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional. An amendment gave the government the right to tax your income. That is the last time a decision by the courts. Now, folk, if it were true checks and balances, a court decision should be overturned 2 or 3 times a year for there to be a balance. But the Supreme Court can't be checked. Simply can't. And someone said, well, doesn't the president appoint? Ah, it's true, the president appoints them. But, folks, once the man is appointed, there is no way to know which way he's going to vote. Just ask Dwight Eisenhower, appointed 2 men thinking they'd be conservative. Their names were Earl Warren and Brennan. Warren and Brennan, I forget Brennan's first name. They both turned out to be ultra-liberal. And Kavanaugh, who was just appointed to the Supreme Court, is not voting the way that some of us thought he would. To me, this is not democracy. The Supreme Court does not even have to abide by the Constitution. When did they violate it? The 15th Amendment, passed shortly after the Civil War, gave blacks the right to vote, even, and it spells out, regardless of previous condition of servitude, which basically means even the ones who were slaves. This actually happened. The 15th Amendment gave the blacks the right to vote, and the Supreme Court stopped it. For 100 years, blacks did not have the right to vote in this country. I mean, some did, but most of them didn't, particularly here in the South. When I was a kid, up until the time I turned about 21, black people could not vote in the South. Most of you know what I'm saying is true. And I can show you out of the Constitution, a copy of it's right in your history book. They were given the right to vote and the Supreme Court overturned it. This is not democracy, folk. And this is not checks and balances either. I had a pupil who I thought was liberal, but he said out loud one day, he said, it's going to take a president who dares to stand up to him and say, no, your decision will not be obeyed. We had one president, Andrew Jackson. He was unfortunately wrong. And today, no president will stand up to the courts. It's grounds for impeachment. But it's going to take one day someone stand up and say, we're not going to put up with this anymore. They make all of our moral decisions for us. Our elected officials do not. If anyone wants to comment, the floor is open. Your comments are welcome. All right, anyway, this has had a beginning right here. Marbury versus Madison. Judicial review. All right, now, in the meantime, Napoleon, over in France, was fighting. If you know anything about French history, Napoleon fought a lot of wars. France was fighting against Spain. France was fighting against Great Britain. France was fighting against Austria and against Russia. And if you think France lost, you're right. Well, Napoleon was running out of money, and some people in America brought Napoleon, if you'll sell this territory west of the Mississippi to the United States, we'll give you millions of dollars. So Napoleon sold it for 2 cents an acre. All of what is today Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Minnesota, and westward Oklahoma, not Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, North and South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. What is today those states was sold to the United States for $15 million. Now Jefferson worried before he, well, the Constitution doesn't give me the right to buy more land. But then there's a clause in the Constitution called the Elastic Clause that said that whatever powers that Congress needs at the moment it can use. It's in effect, I'm paraphrasing. But anyway, Jefferson used the Elastic Clause to justify buying the land. It was said that Napoleon had his brothers. Napoleon gave some of his conquered lands to his brothers, but he had his brothers around. He was sitting in a bathtub, taking a bath, when he signed the document from his tub. And again, keep in mind, Napoleon was such a busy man, he had to sign papers while he ate, signed papers while he took a bath, and would have signed papers while he slept if he could, except he only slept 4 hours a night and only lived a bit more than 40 years. He burned himself out. But he was a terrible worker. I mean, what do you call a terrible worker? Worked himself to death, partly. All right, yeah, I'm wearing you see a famous pose of Napoleon, and I like it. He was holding his stomach, though, because he was suffering with a stomach ailment brought on by eating so much salted food while in his campaign. Eventually, he died of stomach cancer. So he wasn't trying to pose so much as his stomach was hurting him. All right, yeah, his famous pose that he had. I didn't think about that when I put my shirt on this morning, but anyway. I didn't think about it for the morning class either. All right. Now, the steamship was invented about this time also. But anyway, I'm backing up a little bit before we get to the steamship. Jefferson sent 2 men, Lewis and Clark, out west. And the Lewis and Clark expedition stayed gone about 3 years or so, 3 or 4 years. Now, this is not part of the lesson, but I just can't help but insert it. About the time some of you were being born, there was a movie, a TV show that came out, this TV series called Lois and Clark. And it was about Lois Lane and Clark Kent. Maybe some of you have seen it or heard of it, I don't know, but anyway. I see one head nodding. Yeah, Lois, but anyway, this is Lewis and Clark, folks. There is a difference, not Lois Lane, but Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Anyway, they were sent out. The Spanish knew they were being sent, so the Spanish sent an army to look for them. But this territory they were exploring was so big that the Spanish army never found them. But they were sent from Washington, D.C. to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Now, they were not bothered by Indians because they carried an Indian with them, a woman named Sacagawea. Sacagawea was pregnant and started the trip, and of course she had her baby while on the trip. So the Indians who saw the expedition saw an Indian woman with a baby, and that the Indians know, hey, these people are coming in peace, because war Indians never carried women and babies with them. So the Indians were dressed in yellow paint, which is a symbol of peace, and they didn't encounter no difficult Indians. Sacagawea knew a lot about the territory, and also knew some of the Indian languages, like Cortez, who had an Indian woman who could pick up on languages really fast. Sacagawea apparently could pick up on languages pretty fast. But anyway, she served as their guide. And they went all the way across the Great Plains and all the way across the Rockies. Yes? Oh, okay. All right, anyway, they came back after about 3 years. And in the meantime, they had written what they found, what they called flora and fauna, the animal and plant life that they saw while out there. And this excited a lot of the American people, and eventually it led to some people developed a trail called the Oregon Trail, and they moved to Oregon. The land the land in what's called the Great Plains is not all that fertile, not all that great, half desert. I'm talking Kansas, Nebraska, not the best of farmland. And then Colorado and Wyoming and Utah and Montana and is so much mountain land. But then by the time you get to Oregon and Washington, you get to a whole lot of fertile land and good farmland. So a lot of people decided to go, and they followed the Oregon Trail. But the Oregon Trail eventually split off and formed the California Trail, which we'll talk about in a few chapters.
So Lewis and Clark did what?
They went all the way to the Pacific Ocean, exploring the new territory that Jefferson had bought from France. They went all the way there and came back, carrying an Indian guide named Sacagawea. They actually had a big team of them. It wasn't just the three of them. They had a team that's carrying the Indian guide Sacagawea with them. They were acclaimed national heroes, and of course in 2003 we celebrated it. I remember some of you were probably still pretty young at the time, but in 2003 we celebrated the Lewis and Clark expedition that went out west. Well, in the meantime, France and England went to war again. And both sides stopped American shipping and made it highly unprofitable for trade. Thomas Jefferson wanted to keep Washington's advice, so Thomas Jefferson ordered an embargo. In other words, we're not going to trade with either one. Yeah. We're not going to trade with either Britain, or in fact, Thomas Jefferson said, we're not going to trade with anybody. Because he knew that in those days, if a ship left port, he couldn't control where it went. Unlike today, where a president would be in radio contact with a ship and everybody, and the satellites would tell them where the ships were. They didn't have any of that, so Thomas Jefferson said all American ships must stay in port. This led to an economic downturn, a big depression, and everybody said, take off the embargo. When Thomas Jefferson saw it was hurting our own economy, he took off the embargo. But he said, we're not going to trade with England and France. Well, like we knew would happen. Once the ships were out of port, they headed for where they pleased. A lot of ships were captured of both British and the French. This was eventually to lead to another war with Britain. The embargo, anyway. After Jefferson's 8 years were over with, he turned it over to James Madison. James Madison, the fourth president. James Madison got us involved in the War of 1812. Now, big problem with the War of 1812 was it was a war that could have been prevented. Here's how. The British, we had an ambassador in Great Britain, and the British had agreed to stop capturing our seamen and taking our seamen on board their ships and forcing them to fight for the British Navy. This was what the British had been doing, where the British had agreed to stop it. The British had agreed to stop stopping our ships on the high seas. But there was no radio, there was no television. I can't remind you of this enough. So nobody in Washington knew that the British government had agreed to our terms. Instead, we declared war. Now, the War of 1812 was the war that had the least favor of all the wars we've declared. The Civil War was never declared. The Vietnam War was not declared. But of all our declared wars, the percentage who voted for it was just barely above 50%. Nevertheless, the war was declared and the war began. And it started off with the United States having victories on the high seas. The most famous was a ship that we had built called the Constitution. The USS Constitution had sides that were 11 inches thick, and the cannonballs would hit it and bounce off, and it got the nickname Old Ironsides. When British officers saw cannonballs bouncing off, said their sides are made of iron. The Constitution defeated two of the Britain's best warships, the Guerriere and the Java. Keep in mind, the Constitution had 2 rows of decks on each side, and these ships would fire broadside at each other. Well, we had a lot of victories at sea, and then Oliver Hazard Perry got a navy up and won a battle of Lake Erie, again against the British fleet. That was now, we tried to take over Canada, both during the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, and I ought to say the British Army wound up whipping us both times. So the war was undecided as far, nobody won, nobody lost. We won some victories, the British won some victories. But the worst part of the war for America was in 1814, when the British Army came to our capital at Washington and set fire to the White House. James Madison with his wife Dolly was eating a luncheon. When they heard the news that the British Army had arrived, they quickly fled. But Dolly Madison, to her everlasting credit, grabbed a portrait of George Washington from the wall. And today every president's portrait's on the White House wall, but she grabbed a portrait, which we still have, and preserved it, saved it. The White House was set on fire. It was the president's mansion, was set on fire. It did not burn down. When the war was over, we repainted the house.